Society constantly tells us that love is the ultimate answer to everything. Open your heart fully, give endlessly, remain soft, and the world will protect you, respect you, and return your kindness. This romantic notion permeates our culture. The idea that vulnerability equals strength and that unconditional love is the highest virtue. But Machiavelli saw things differently. Through his penetrating lens, love wasn't simply a gift. It was a potential liability, an unlocked door, a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. A person who depends entirely on love, who leads with their heart exposed, creates the perfect conditions for their own downfall. Not because love itself is inherently flawed, but because it blinds us to the strategic realities of human interaction. When you love deeply, something fundamental changes in your psychological framework. The protective filters that normally guard your interests begin to dissolve. You share everything, forgive prematurely, and justify harmful behavior directed at you. The rational mind steps aside as emotional attachment takes over. You operate under the dangerous assumption, I would never hurt them, so they would never hurt me. This equivalence is where Machiavelli would find fatal naivety. The most perilous aspect isn't in the enemies we recognize, but in the familiarity we cultivate. Your declared opponents approach with caution, respecting your boundaries precisely because they expect retaliation. But those close to you? They grow accustomed to your softness. They become comfortable with unlimited access to your resources, time, and emotional energy. They expect your loyalty without earning it. Your forgiveness becomes an entitlement rather than a gift. Over time, this dynamic creates an imbalance that transforms love into a tool of exploitation. Not always intentionally, sometimes the people who care for you can harm you without malice. But inevitably, when someone knows you won't enforce consequences, they subconsciously test how far they can push. Your kindness becomes weakness in their eyes. Your accessibility becomes a given rather than a privilege. Machiavelli didn't advocate eliminating love from your life. His insight was more nuanced. Love requires containment, boundaries, and strategic awareness. Love with a ceiling, love with costs, love with clear parameters, because without these limits, emotional exposure becomes your default state. And emotional exposure is the most exploitable position anyone can find themselves in. To be cold-blooded in the Machiavellian sense isn't about cruelty. It's about awareness. Being alert to how people's behavior shifts when they're granted unlimited emotional access. Understanding what you sacrifice when you become completely transparent. Recognizing how unchecked love transforms into entitlement. This awareness leads to an uncomfortable truth. Those who claim to love you unconditionally may still hurt you accidentally, while those who remain close only for what you provide will harm you deliberately. The solution isn't abandoning love altogether, but reconsidering how you lead with it. The moment you prioritize feelings over strategy, you forfeit leverage in every relationship. Have you noticed how your family often dismisses your advice? How friends stop listening once they've gotten what they wanted? How partners sometimes don't genuinely fear losing you? These patterns emerge because they've recognized your emotional algorithm. Your love overrides your logic. They know you'll apologize first. You'll return regardless of how you're treated. You'll explain yourself endlessly, defend your feelings passionately, but never enforce meaningful consequences. This predictability makes you safe to disappoint. When Machiavelli famously stated, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both," he recognized a fundamental truth about human nature. Yet with those closest to us, the idea of being feared feels wrong, almost sacrilegious. So we stop playing the strategic game entirely, and they start winning it by default. The price of maintaining this warmth is steep. Standards lower incrementally. You accept behaviors that would be unforgivable from strangers. You forgive without seeing genuine reform. You maintain silence just to preserve a fragile peace. But this peace is merely the comfort others take in your weakness. And when someone becomes comfortable with your weakness, they will test it, then probe it, and ultimately exploit it. The alternative isn't becoming heartless. It's loving with boundaries so precisely defined they could cut. Let others experience your warmth, but always with a protective wall behind it. Because the moment your love becomes truly unconditional, so does your suffering. We aren't destroyed by strangers. We're broken by those we've granted the closest access to our hearts. Machiavelli understood this dynamic with remarkable clarity. He wasn't paranoid. He was precise. He recognized that the people who know your vulnerabilities, your boundaries, and your sensitivities are most likely to press against them, not necessarily out of malice, but because they've stopped fearing the consequences. And when fear exits a relationship, respect often follows it out the door. Every connection you form eventually faces silent tests that reveal the true nature of your relationships. The first and most revealing is the entitlement test. Notice when expressions of gratitude vanish, when people stop asking permission, when they cease acknowledging how much you're giving. This shift isn't accidental. It reflects a fundamental change in perception. In their minds, you've become a guaranteed resource, an extension of their needs rather than an individual with boundaries. When you inevitably establish limits or decline a request, you're suddenly labeled selfish or cold. You've changed, they'll say, as though your self-preservation represents a betrayal. Machiavelli would recognize this reaction instantly. It's the sound of someone mourning the loss of their advantage, not the loss of your authentic connection. Perhaps more insidious is the guilt reflex test. You establish a boundary. They respond with emotional displays. You decline a request. They resurrect past favors. You protect your time. They label you distant or uncaring. What appears to be a conversation has transformed into a tactical maneuver. They've learned that inducing guilt provides leverage over your decisions, and once they discover this emotional shortcut works, they'll file it away for future use. This isn't love. It's emotional negotiation. And if you cannot maintain your position when guilt enters the equation, you never truly had boundaries to begin with. Your limits become suggestions that can be overridden with the right emotional pressure. The loyalty loop represents another critical test. You've demonstrated consistent support, reliability, and dedication. But when these qualities flow in only one direction, they transform from mutual exchange into expectation. The other party stops reciprocating, checks in less frequently, and appears only when circumstances benefit them. When you eventually withdraw this one-sided investment, their panic isn't about losing you. It's about losing their emotional insurance policy. As Machiavelli might observe, when your loyalty becomes predictable, it will be exploited long before it's appreciated. Consistent, unwavering devotion without equivalent return doesn't inspire gratitude. It normalizes imbalance. The just this once test begins subtly but escalates with alarming speed. It starts with small requests, covering an expense, canceling plans on short notice, overlooking a minor transgression, just this once. But once you accommodate these exceptions, they never remain singular. You've demonstrated that your principles are flexible under the right conditions, that your boundaries bend when pressed. This revelation is powerful information. You've become someone who can be persuaded to compromise their values if approached correctly. That's not intimacy, it's strategic pressure testing. Each exception creates precedent for the next, slightly larger request. Finally, watch for the "you're too harsh" defense. When you communicate clearly, you're labeled cold. When you withdraw access, you're called stone-hearted. When your patience finds its limit, you're deemed heartless. This rhetorical strategy transforms your strengths into character flaws, your boundaries into moral failings. The uncomfortable truth? They don't actually miss your warmth. They miss access to the version of you who allowed them to act without consequences. Now that this permissive iteration has disappeared, they frame your evolution as cruelty rather than clarity. Machiavelli would recognize these patterns instantly. He would tell us, the closer someone stands to you, the more they expect you to absorb their chaos without complaint. When you refuse this role, they'll call you cold, claim you've changed, and frame your growth as betrayal. Let them. The person who fears offending everyone they love inevitably finds themselves surrounded by people who love how easily they can be offended. These individuals don't value your growth. They resent the loss of their influence over you. The solution isn't complicated, though implementing it requires courage. Stop justifying your boundaries. You don't need to explain your distance, defend your detachment, or apologize for outgrowing emotional systems that no longer serve you. Simply enforce your standards, silently, consistently, without hesitation. Let the accusations come. Allow the discomfort to surface. Once people realize the previous version of you, the one who bled on command, has evolved, they must either adapt to this new reality or exit your life. Either outcome strengthens your position. Being strategic about your emotional investments doesn't mean becoming heartless. Establishing boundaries doesn't equal disconnection. Protecting yourself isn't selfish. But these are precisely the accusations you'll face when you stop overgiving, over-explaining, and overlending yourself to others. This marks the point where most people falter in their personal evolution. They either remain soft and become perpetual victims or go completely hard and lose their humanity in the process. Machiavelli advocated for neither extreme. He championed a middle path of strategic empathy, where compassion exists within carefully constructed boundaries. Creating boundaries that actually protect you requires systematic implementation, not sporadic enforcement. The first rule of this architecture is perhaps the most challenging. Never explain your emotional distance. When you pull back, go silent, or decline engagement, you don't owe a detailed justification for this recalibration. The moment you begin explaining your boundaries, you inadvertently invite negotiation. Each reason you provide becomes a potential point of contention, an argument to be dismantled. Machiavelli would recognize that explaining is defensive while acting without justification signals authority. When someone questions your changed behavior, why are you acting different? What happened to us? Why didn't you reach out? Resist the urge to unload your reasoning. Instead, simply acknowledge the shift. I've recalibrated. This concise response, free from emotional elaboration, commands respect while revealing who was never capable of giving it. The second architectural principle transforms how you communicate expectations. Establish consequences rather than conditions. Most people operate through conditional statements. Don't speak to me that way again. If you do this, I'll be upset. Please respect my boundaries. These phrases beg for better treatment without establishing real deterrence. Machiavelli never pleaded for respect. He designed systems that made disrespect costly. Instead of saying, "Don't do that," demonstrate through action. When you do that, I disappear. And critically, you don't return when they panic or apologize. You return when you decide the time is right, if ever. Boundaries don't plead, they act. That's how they derive their power. The third element requires mastering emotional neutrality during conflicts. Once someone discovers your emotional triggers, that you become tearful when pressured, anxious when ignored, or rush to reconcile when they withdraw, they stop engaging with your intellect and begin manipulating your feelings. Emotional clarity functions as a shield, and once penetrated, opponents no longer aim for your mind. They target your wounds. Protect yourself by becoming unreadable under pressure. No lengthy explanations, no emotional outbursts, no impulsive reconciliation after being hurt. Your silence becomes leverage. Your composure becomes your position. If they want access to your vulnerability, they must earn it through consistent respect. The fourth principle demands unwavering consistency. Define what you'll tolerate and never deviate. Many people establish boundaries that fluctuate based on who's testing them, their emotional state, or how long they've known the person. This inconsistency represents weakness, a form of emotional currency inflation that diminishes your worth. Develop clear binary rules. I don't respond to raised voices. Once I establish distance, it remains until I choose otherwise. I don't accept apologies without changed behavior. Then, enforce these standards without exception. People rarely test firmly established boundaries. They probe for flexibility. Machiavelli didn't punish frequently, but when he did, it was decisive, calculated, and final. Your boundaries require the same surgical precision. The fifth architectural element requires perhaps the greatest courage. Don't fear being perceived as harsh. This is where most boundary-setting efforts collapse. People recognize when they're being used or disrespected, but hesitate to enforce consequences because society equates boundless patience with virtue and firm boundaries with cruelty. Conventional wisdom suggests that explanation equals fairness, endless access equals forgiveness, and immediate reconciliation equals compassion. Machiavelli rejected these equivalencies. He didn't fear being called cold. He feared being called easily manipulated. Let others label your boundaries however they wish. Allow them to rewrite your character to fit their narrative of victimhood. When you prioritize reputation over reality, you surrender power for the illusion of likability. Perception changes nothing about your actual circumstances. You aren't being cold. You're being uncompromising. Love without boundaries inevitably becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice without recognition transforms into a form of emotional servitude. Machiavelli would never willingly perish on someone else's emotional battlefield. He would observe, withdraw, and return only when respected. That's not coldness, it's self-preservation. This brings us to the final challenge in boundary architecture, the fear of losing oneself. Many hesitate to implement these principles because they worry, what if I become numb? What if I lose my capacity for connection? What if I go cold and can't return? This concern stems from confusing strategic boundary setting with emotional detachment. Machiavelli didn't abandon his humanity. He mastered when and how to deploy it. In his worldview, feeling everything without discrimination meant being controlled by everything. Strategic thinking isn't cruelty, it's control. You don't stop experiencing emotions. You stop reacting impulsively when circumstances require calculation. You still love, care, connect, and reflect, but only within the protective structures you've established. These walls don't isolate you from genuine connection. They prevent you from becoming a pawn in someone else's emotional game. Being strategic about your boundaries doesn't mean lacking warmth. It means choosing when to offer it and to whom. That's not emotional absence. It's emotional intelligence. Mastering your boundaries begins with transforming your internal processing. When someone disappoints or disrespects you, your immediate instinct might be to react emotionally, to feel wounded, betrayed, or angry. The strategic mind, however, shifts from reaction to observation. This doesn't mean suppressing your feelings. It means elevating your analysis above your initial emotional response. Instead of asking, why did they do this to me? The calculated thinker asks, what did this just teach me about them? This subtle reframing transforms painful experiences from personal affronts into valuable intelligence. Machiavelli would approach betrayal not as a wound to nurse, but as information to leverage. What can I extract from this moment that makes me stronger? The cold-blooded thinker sees pain as positioning, not personal loss. Each disappointment reveals someone's character, priorities, and reliability more accurately than their promises ever could. This perspective doesn't eliminate the hurt, but it transforms it from a debilitating experience into a strategic advantage. Cultivating this mindset requires mastering the art of delayed reaction. Consider what truly intimidates others in conflict situations. It's not explosive anger, passionate shouting, or even calculated revenge. It's the person who witnesses betrayal and responds with composed silence, who creates distance without explanation, who removes access without dramatic announcements. When you react immediately to provocation, you become predictable. Your buttons are easily identifiable and therefore easily pushed. Machiavelli didn't act on impulse, he acted on advantage. His teachings emphasize that power doesn't come from having the strongest emotional reaction, but from exercising the most strategic timing. Every time you feel disrespected, disappointed, or replaced, you face a critical choice. Take it personally or transform it into intelligence. The strategic mind doesn't waste energy lamenting what's lost. It methodically catalogs who has demonstrated the capacity to lose you and adjusts access accordingly. This approach converts pain into clarity, distance into power, and loss into evolution. When you remain emotionally reactive, you grant others influence over your perception of reality. But when you absorb information quietly before responding, you become the person no one wants to cross twice. Your unpredictability becomes your strength. Most people approach relationships like warfare but enter unarmed. They proclaim, "I'll give them everything. I'll support them through their worst moments. They'll eventually recognize my value." But Machiavelli recognized that hope is not a strategy, and kindness without discipline often becomes self-destruction in disguise. The solution isn't closing your heart entirely, but building a selective gateway. Behind this gate lies a fundamental principle. Only those who demonstrate consistent respect earn access to your vulnerability. Your warmth becomes a privilege to be earned rather than a resource to be expected. Your care becomes conditional, not because you lack compassion, but because you understand your value. The final hurdle in developing this calculated mindset is accepting that you will be misunderstood. This is where many abandon the path to true personal power. They want to be strategic, but also universally liked. They desire respect, but fear being perceived as difficult or cold. Machiavelli would identify this as a fatal contradiction. If you need others to approve of your evolution, you've already surrendered the freedom to evolve. You will inevitably be labeled cold, detached, or changed when you stop fulfilling the role others have come to expect, when you no longer bleed on command or sacrifice your interests for their comfort. Let them misinterpret your boundaries. Their discomfort isn't evidence of your failure. It's confirmation of their lost access to the previous version of you, the version that was easier to influence, manipulate, or hurt. Being strategically minded doesn't equate to heartlessness. Emotional calculation doesn't mean disconnection. Strength doesn't equal selfishness. Yet these are precisely the accusations you'll face when you stop overgiving, over-explaining, and overextending yourself. Most people either remain perpetually vulnerable to exploitation or become so defensive they lose their capacity for genuine connection. Machiavelli championed a more nuanced middle path, one of strategic empathy that balances self-protection with authentic connection. This path requires ongoing vigilance and refined judgment, but it preserves both your boundaries and your humanity. Maintaining your power without sacrificing your humanity requires deliberate intention. The first step is clearly differentiating between your purpose and others' perception of you. Ask yourself, am I establishing boundaries to harm others or to protect myself? Am I creating distance out of coldness or because I'm being depleted? Am I silent because I'm being passive-aggressive or because I've already communicated sufficiently? If your motivations center on self-protection rather than retaliation, you're following the right path. Machiavelli didn't concern himself with appearing noble. He focused on maintaining his position. People who preserve their boundaries without resorting to cruelty are rare. That's the standard worth aspiring to. The second element of strategic empathy involves showing mercy without compromising your standards. There's nothing inherently wrong with offering someone another chance, extending kindness without naivety, or helping someone you've previously distanced from if they've demonstrated growth. The danger lies not in the mercy itself, but in forgetting why you established distance in the first place. When you reopen access, maintain your standards. Don't erase the consequences or return without clear terms. You can offer warmth without surrendering your position. This balance, compassion with conditions, embodies true strategic empathy. The third aspect involves controlling your presence, not just your distance. Many believe that withdrawing equals power, but Machiavelli understood that calibrated presence carries greater influence. Strategic engagement means appearing briefly, communicating with precision, and departing while your absence is still felt. You become a reminder rather than an adversary, not an emotional reactor, but a composed force. Someone who changes the atmosphere simply by entering or exiting a situation. This represents authority without aggression. The fourth principle distinguishes between maintaining standards and exercising control. You cannot force others to respect you, but you can make disrespect costly. This means avoiding demands for apologies, forced communication, or explanations. Instead, you withdraw access, remove emotional privileges, and let silence communicate your position. If others rise to meet your standards, you can re-engage. If not, they've demonstrated they don't belong in your evolved life. This isn't manipulation. It's allowing natural consequences to unfold. The fifth element transforms how you express kindness. You don't stop being kind. You stop being careless with your kindness. You extend it thoughtfully, after observation, with internal checkpoints and clear exit strategies if situations deteriorate. If others call this approach transactional, let them. Unconditional giving sounds noble until it's weaponized against your well-being. Selective generosity, offering only what aligns with your values, energy, and emotional health, isn't selfishness but self-governance. It preserves your capacity for meaningful generosity rather than depleting it through indiscriminate giving. The final component of strategic empathy involves enforcing boundaries rather than defending them. When others call you cold, distant, or changed, resist the urge to explain or justify. You don't need to debate your transformation. You simply continue its implementation. Power isn't demonstrated through conversation, but revealed through consistency. If people miss the previous version of you, they're welcome to their memories. But they don't receive access to your evolved self until they prove they've grown alongside you. This isn't cruelty. It's clarity about the terms of engagement. Balance isn't about walking a perfect line. It's about implementing a sophisticated filter. You aren't meant to become emotionally impenetrable, but to become discerning, reflecting others accurately, offering warmth selectively, maintaining composure regardless of provocation. This represents Machiavellian empathy, strategic, conditional, and unwavering in its boundaries. You've recognized the warning signs, identified the patterns, and outgrown the version of yourself that was too accommodating to remain secure. The final challenge isn't theoretical but practical, transforming these insights into a sustainable lifestyle. Implementing strategic boundaries requires more than theoretical understanding. It demands consistent application through habits, rituals, and repetitive practices. Machiavelli didn't merely theorize about power. He embodied it. If you aim to maintain your boundaries in a world that constantly pressures you to revert to emotional servitude, you need practical guidelines that become second nature. The first habit involves moving without announcement. You don't declare, "I'm cutting you off," or "I'm creating space," or "I'm focusing on myself." You simply adjust your behavior. You slow your response time, stop providing detailed explanations, and maintain your withdrawal once implemented. Authentic boundaries don't require lengthy declarations. They're demonstrated through consistent behavior rather than proclamations. Machiavelli didn't seek agreement regarding his strategic silence. He ensured people felt its consequences. When you stop announcing your boundaries and simply enforce them, you eliminate the opportunity for debate or manipulation. The second practice maintains politeness without excessive familiarity. Your warmth should be earned rather than automatically granted. Greet others with composure, offer compliments with purpose, and exit interactions while still respected. This calibrated approach keeps your demeanor disciplined and your boundaries clear. The emotionally indiscriminate person becomes easy to manipulate, while someone who remains precisely calibrated in their interactions becomes virtually impossible to control. Your strategic nature doesn't stem from harshness, but from structure, knowing exactly when to engage and when to withdraw. The third habit, perhaps most crucial, involves reflection before reaction. When someone disappoints you, resist the impulse to respond immediately. When someone crosses your boundaries, avoid escalation. When someone behaves inappropriately, document the pattern rather than confronting it immediately. Being strategic doesn't mean feeling nothing. It means never allowing emotion to precede thought. This pause, this internal processing before external expression, becomes your competitive advantage. While others spiral into emotional reactions, panic, shout, or withdraw into sulking, your composure will prove more intimidating than any outburst could. The fourth practice honors the finality of your decisions. Never reopen what you've closed without requalification. If you ended a relationship, friendship, or partnership, require genuine growth before considering renewed access. Too many people return to damaging situations because of apologies, the passage of time, or hope for change. Time alone doesn't heal betrayal. Elevated standards do. If someone hasn't genuinely evolved, you haven't missed anything by maintaining distance. This discipline preserves your energy for connections that actually deserve your investment. The fifth habit treats your peace as a private strategy rather than a public statement. Don't transform your emotional maturity into performance or content. You aren't implementing boundaries so others will admire you. You're establishing them so people respect what they can't access without effort. Live quietly, protect deliberately, and let the results of your self-discipline speak more eloquently than any explanation could. This represents the Machiavellian ideal, complete personal sovereignty without the need for external validation. True strategic thinking isn't demonstrated through harshness, but through consistency. It doesn't require cruelty, only clarity. It doesn't demand emotional detachment, just emotional discernment. This balance, power without brutality, boundaries without isolation, represents the practical application of cold-blooded wisdom. You've now completed the journey from understanding vulnerability to implementing strength. The world will continue offering the same tests, the same pressures to compromise, the same accusations when you refuse to be manipulated. But you now possess something invaluable, a systematic approach to maintaining your boundaries without sacrificing your humanity. This isn't about becoming impenetrable, but becoming intentional. Not about eliminating love, but protecting it with precision. Not about rejecting connection, but ensuring it occurs on terms that honor your worth. In a world that celebrates endless giving until burnout, strategic self-protection represents not selfishness, but wisdom. The final insight of Machiavellian philosophy applied to personal relationships isn't that people are inherently untrustworthy or that love is fundamentally dangerous. It's that navigating human connection requires both heart and strategy. The cold-blooded thinker doesn't abandon emotion, they simply refuse to let it override their judgment. In this balance, this fusion of feeling and calculation, warmth and boundaries, compassion and standards, lies the true art of strategic living. Not coldness for its own sake, but precisely calibrated engagement that preserves both your power and your humanity. This synthesis represents Machiavelli's most enduring legacy, the understanding that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from mastering yourself.